Greetings everyone, this is Umby again, and we're back with some more coverage on the top cut of the VGC Draft League that we entered. So quick shout outs, first things first, congrats to everyone that made it here. Of course, my opponent Eclipse Owl from group number 4, but also showing up from group number 2, all three of us, Josh, Detrevdo, and myself have made it into top 4. 3 out of the top 4 seeds of one group making it into the top 4 of the entire competition is nuts. So round of applause, for everyone there. That being said, normally my usual video is commentary during my actual match. I'm not gonna have that for you this week, but I can confirm that I did make it into the top 2, so the final match. So it will be a group number 2 versus group number 2 final. I am excited for that. Since I'm not doing the usual thing, I thought it would be a cool idea to look at the drafts that did make it to these final rounds, and then we'll look over the replay for Josh versus Detrevdo in a later video. So, and we've talked about these teams before when we did the matchup breakdown from the previous video, but just to kind of look at these in a vacuum, and what I just want to point out what I like or dislike about the drafts, starting with Josh's team, which I think has warranted the position that's been in as a top 4 contender, a top contender for winning the entire thing, to be honest. So when I look at this team, I think there are 3 main ways, I'll call them, to approach building the draft in the first place. I'd say 1, you can try and build like a well-rounded team and try and play, just enable solid gameplay. So you build out your grass, water, fire core, dragon, steel, fairy core, get your support mon, redirector, what have you. You start checking off these boxes. You try and make just a solid draft where you try and be the better player turn by turn. You can go for a central strategy and then build around that. So immediately thinking about some of the Colossal plus Sneasel or Aqua Jetter teams, where you have 2 Pokemon that you're trying to enable, and then everything around it is addressing specific matchups that it hates. Even something like JP's Regigigas Wheezing team, right, is another example. And then there is what Josh is currently employed, where you take these mini combinations and you stack them on top of each other. So what I mean by that, obviously you can see that the team has Pelipper and Kingdra. I think that's the first thing everyone will see, is just swift swim strategies, right? You get that immediate speed control, you get the immediate pressure of the high damage that Kingdra can bring during rain as a max option. But then you also have their Tapu Lele and Liepard, which is a common combination for them. So with a Psychic Unburdened Seed, it doesn't have to worry about Prankster. It's just faster than everything else on the field while being immune to Prankster itself. And then it gets to set up fake tears for the Tapu Lele, or it gets to set up speed control by applying Thunder Wave to everything. Foul Plays for physical threats, Taunt for versus utilities, even Snarl to help with special offenders. It's really a lot to take on all at once. So when you start stacking those on top of everything, because right now defensively, it is lacking overall as a team defensively. Outside of Celesteela, everything's pretty frail or pretty exposed. There's not really any utility put into getting screens up, for example. So once you get past the Celesteela, if you get hit, you're probably dying in 1 or 2 turns. Now the issue with that is because they're stacking all these strategies up on top of each other, the Pelipper Kingdra, Liepard Lele, Celesteela plus Raichu, you're always kind of on the back foot. It puts that immediate pressure on you that you have to answer defensively, And if you can't counterattack effectively from that position, you're liable to just get rolled by the team. And then the other problem is if you do get an offensive advantage, even that's tough because when we start looking at the combinations they can put together. Let's say they have Pelipper, Kingdra, and then Celesteela, right? If you're trying to touch the Kingdra, you can only hit it effectively through a fairy or dragon move. Well, guess what resists both fairy and dragon moves? The Celesteela. You can only hit with electric or fire moves. The electric types are redirected from Lightning Rod from both Raichu and Marowak. And then the fire type moves are kind of doused out by the drizzle that Pelipper gets to set up. So it's really, really hard because you're really only hitting at neutral. And if the neutral hits are very unlikely to knock out enough Pokemon before two of your Pokemon get knocked out in turn. So I think they found themselves a really solid position with this draft where they can be heavily offensive without being too defensively exposed, because it's pretty much an afterthought. It's not necessarily something that they have to worry about as long as they keep their immense speed advantage. Now for the Trevdo's team, this one is pretty weird. So some context first. By the postseason, they actually dropped several Pokemon. So Gigalith, Excadrill, and Landorus Eye being the main ones, kind of made this central sand strategy they can try and use to overwhelm the opponent. They also had Tangela and Maractus. Admittedly, Maractus is not really doing too much, but Tangela as a cheap cost redirector was something for them. But they traded those all out for Glastrier, Cresselia, Colossal, Gengar, and Golduck. Now, in my eyes, Cresselia and Glastrier it makes some sense. Obviously, if you're trying to get Glastrier to do some heavy lifting, you want the Trick Room. I think the problem is Glastrier inside of a draft format where you can kind of cater to each matchup. I think it's harder for it to perform or even position really. So once Cresselia is in position to set up Trick Room, it's kind of like, who is it setting up Trick Room for, which is tough, and then what is it doing in Trick Room itself, which is also tough. You could use the Colossal under Trick Room. It is base 30 speed after all, but it's typically trying to employ weakness policy strategies to increase what is essentially a middling offense. And it doesn't really have as much of a luxury to do that in Trick Room. Like, you can omit the Steam Engine and go for like Flash Fire, Flame Body, sure, but you're kind of pigeonholed into using Golduck as an Aqua Jet user to proc that weakness policy, and that of course makes things like really awkward. It's not using Golduck under Trick Room. It feels like a waste of a slot. Outside of Trick Room, you can use Aqua Jet plus Steam Engine or Scarf Surf to get ahead of certain matchups. But the problem, it's not really even a problem, just the thing. This is not the G-Max version of Colossal, just the regular one. So you're not going to get that same kind of residual damage from using like Max Rockfall, right? And so then the only other option past that is Incineroar. So if you're using Incineroar under Trick Room, you're typically looking at it as an offensive unit rather than its usual defensive utility, which we saw in the previous matchup from the Trevdo, where they did end up using like Sword Stance under Trick Room to great effect to get that win, get into the top 4. Past that, I don't hate the Gengar pick at all. I know it just in general it looks weird, but having a high speed threat on the team, special threat at that, but also a ghost type. I know particularly I'm worried about ghost types when it comes to my Registeel. If anyone else was using Registeel, it would have positioned him to be able to directly counter that through like Taunt or Will-O-Wisp, which they've used in the previous matchup, also to great effect. But they've also used stuff like Ally Switch, or even offensive Gengar comes into consideration as options. So I think overall it's a flexible unit, just very difficult to use because of its typing and its defensive stats, right? Yeah, that's the most I can really say about it, because while it has a solid fire, water, grass core through Rillaboom, Incineroar, Milotic, can't go wrong, at least with Rillaboom and Incineroar. It suffers from the issue that it doesn't have anything overwhelming. Like you can even look at Porygon Z. Normally, that's the thing that you look out for, because it's base 90 speed. You don't really have Tailwind. You have to use kind of like Cotton Spore from Cottony, or Hope Prankster Thunderwave from Meowstic Sticks, but that's only single target. So the Porygon Z doesn't really do anything to overwhelm the opponents in the same way that like a Regigigas Weezing would do so, or if they had like G-Max Colossal instead. So they're basically having to pick these Pokemon and play very specific logic lines in order to get past the opponent's main offense or main defense even, and then kind of I don't want to say cheese is too harsh of a word, but they have to kind of like surprise the opponent and throw them off base in order to grab the win, which they've done so far, and that's kind of their testament as a player for making it so far. All right, next up is Eclipse Owl's team. Now, unlike the other two, I haven't been following them through this competition. Obviously with my own group, I've been kind of invested in their success, so I kind of want to see, but I haven't had an opportunity to really check out how Eclipse Owl plays. So really just looking at this draft in a vacuum and seeing how it reflects upon them, from there. And I think that overall, it is a solid draft. I'm saying that very slowly because I think it suffers from a similar issue that Detrevdo has, where there's nothing that says, okay, you have to address me. Like you 100% have to prepare for this. Otherwise, you just immediately lose. You could say that the Chansey and Shuckle are the ones that do that, because if you don't address them, they can kind of cheese you out. I don't think that's a harsh term here. Like literally, if you're using Chansey and Shuckle, you're attempting to cheese out the opponent rather than do like any supportive utility, right? But like outside of that, I think their Grass, Water, Fire core is really solid. Blastoise next to Rillaboom is really cool because Rillaboom addresses the water types that Blastoise fears, and resists the electric types. I mean, that's just how Grass, Water, Fire works in the first place. But there's an added benefit that Rillaboom is attacking from priority with Grassy Glide, and also gives the option for Blastoise to use Grass type Terrain Pulse as well, which is a benefit. And then the Heatran is really cool because not only is it a flying type resist and poison immunity, which helps out the Rillaboom, but if you decide to max it, it's also got access to max Steel Spike and max Quake. So on top of being a great offensive utility from base 130 special attack, it's also a really good way to set up your defenses as well. Its defensive stats are actually pretty solid too. Base 91 HP, base 106 in both defenses. As you increase those stats, it makes Heatran that much harder to deal with. So once it's out of max, it just continues doing like immense chip damage through the heat wave if it chooses to do so, right? From there, it's really tricky. Like obviously the Porygon 2 is screaming for using the use of Trick Room, which overall I think the team utilizes pretty solidly. Doesn't have the slowest mons. We're talking about anything outside of Chansey and Shuckle. But Regirock is a prime target for it as well, and I think it's a good addition to this team too. It kind of inches closer to solving the issue that is you must address this Pokemon. Like, because there's always a threat that Regirock has weakness policy, or even bulk up or curse, what have you. So if you don't start slowing it down before it gets rolling, it can be very difficult to deal with in the later stages of the game. But if you try to address it too early, you end up proccing its weakness policy, and if it's under Trick Room, it's just going to steamroll the team. Then you have, I think what kind of closes the loop pretty well is Grimmsnarl and Goodra. Grimmsnarl just being a really solid support mon overall. We've sung its praises before, no surprise there. But in combination with Goodra and Heatran, you get your Steel Fairy Dragon Core. And Goodra's not really a terrible addition. It's always nice to have a dragon type. It's a nice way to kind of augment your defenses, since dragon is resistant to so many types. It's resistant to fire, so that helps out the Rillaboom and Blastoise or Heatran can't come along, or even Regirock. So Regirock doesn't have to risk getting burned. Resistant to electric types for when Rillaboom or Thunderous Therian aren't in position. There's a lot of utility in just having the defensive typing, along with its great special bulk, but also gets a lot offensively as well. You can go a physical set and take advantage of Sap Sipper for the use of Rillaboom Grassy Glides if you really want. You have things like Flamethrower, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, Draco Meteor, like the list goes on. I think it's one of the more flexible Pokemon in this unit, to where used to great effect can not only surprise the opponent's Pokemon, but also just become like this really cool max option that has to be addressed as well. But again, it's still not to the level of something like a G-Max Colossal, or even like a Sun Team, like Torkoal Venusaur, right? It doesn't create that question that needs to be answered, but it is definitely a really solid nuisance to use against opponents. So yeah, overall, I think solid draft allows for a solid early and mid game. I just think the late game is always variable, because even once you've wasted the opponent's resources, what's the Pokemon that you use to close up the match, right? There's not like this really fast threat that really wants to work outside of Dynamax, and overall just the speed is lacking, so it really wants Trick Room to persist as long as it can throughout the game, which can happen, but it's like you also have to keep your primary Trick Room Pokemon alive throughout that entire time, so it wants a very consistent, steady game from turn 1 to kind of close everything out. Now, as far as my draft, I'm not going to get too much into it because I've made a whole video breaking that down if you want to check that out. But I'm really happy with this draft overall. Just like very few complaints about what was selected. I think it turned out very well rounded, but also presents that question of, all right, you kind of have to deal with this through the use of like Thundurus, through Thundurus and Urshifu, and very often Serena in specific matchups. Got my Grass Water Fire Core. I now have a redirector through the Togetic. Grimmsnarl was like an amazing pickup as far as utility. It's been, even if I haven't used it, it's been part of every single team that I've created so far. And then I have Registeel just as this really cheeky option that if you that's like the major question. If you don't address this or don't have the tools to address it, I can just potentially steal back games, and it's that simple. But yeah, if you want a full breakdown, check out the earlier video that I made. I'll link it in the description if you need it to. But it's also part of the same playlist. But yeah, I thought it was really cool. I'm glad I was able to pilot it to this top 2 position. But as far as whether or not it can take the entire competition, we'll have to see when we get to the battle in the following week. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. And again, not going to be able to go through the battle from this week in the top 4 for myself, but we'll go through the Trevdo versus Josh in the next one. If you could, any feedback, I always appreciate it. Leave it in the comments below. Leave a like if you feel so inclined to. Either way, I will see you in the next one. Take care.